Oh, is this I think there is a video function on here.
Hello. This is going to be the first part of a two-part video, although there'll probably be something between this and the next part. But it's going to be a video on a very old sociolect of English. So a sociolect being like a dialect but spoken by a particular socioeconomic group rather than a regional group. And this sociolect is African American vernacular English. And like a lot of smaller dialect and sociolect of English, it's quite difficult to get to the bottom of how it developed and how it diverged from Standard English, if it did diverge from Standard English, because it's gone largely unrecorded throughout history. So today this is going to be a little bit of musing on the development of AAVE and also a conversation with a native speaker about how it's regarded today and how it's treated in the school system. So to introduce the idea of African American vernacular English, it's a cluster of sociolect of English spoken across the US in African American communities, and it's been the subject of recent linguistic studies because it's developed quite differently from Standard English. So if you're looking at dialects of English that have a lot of marked grammatical differences from Standard English, you will tend to look to rural areas. But AAVE has significant grammatical differences and it's spoken in city environments, and because of historical factors it's gone largely unrecorded. So even where you do have early African American literary figures like William Du Bois, who were writing in the 19th century, they weren't writing in AAVE because it was seen as a lower register sociolect, just as it is nowadays. And to show a couple of the better known features of AAVE that are distinct from Standard English grammatically, I'll put a little slide on screen explaining the aspect system. So you end up with this widespread perception today that AAVE is the result of bad education and people not learning English correctly. But in reality, that's not how language learning works. So we have this idea that you go to school, you learn to read and write and talk, you get taught the rules of grammar, you get taught the rules of spelling, and you leave school able to speak English properly. But really, reading and writing are not intimately connected to each other, and every healthy human child is going to pick up a perfectly internally consistent language from their parents or whoever's around them when they're growing up, regardless of formal education. And that is the case with AAVE. It's completely internally consistent and it's picked up mostly by exposure. And that leads to a complicated situation of what's called code switching. And code switching is something that we all kind of do on some level. It's just when you're in a different situation, you will talk slightly differently, almost automatically. So if you're speaking to an employer or your friends or your teacher or your parents, you're going to have a slightly different way of speaking around all these people, whether that has to do with politeness or just in-jokes you've come up with over the years. But if you are kind of bi-dialectal, you speak two quite different dialects or sociolects, then this is going to be a lot more complicated, and that's the case for a lot of AAVE speakers. They have to code switch between different situations. So I'm going to talk to a native speaker now about his experience with code switching and how it affects him in his daily life. And this was done over Discord, and my recording software is not the best, so apologies if it's a bit janky, but yeah.
Code switching, in my opinion, I guess opinion isn't fact, but in my experience, code switching is when you act or do something different or say something different, talk in a different way, if you behave differently, depending on the situation you're in. Some people experience this when they have like divorced parents, in which case they would hop from their mom to their dad, doing different things because maybe their household is set up differently, or maybe they'll act a different way, at home than they would at school, or maybe at a friend's house than they would at school, or
So it's
go ahead.
sorry. I was going to say it's different behaviour and speech in different social situations, and it's kind of automatic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like you naturally slip from one to the other, but I understand it can be exhausting if it's kind of between two very different dialects or two very different sociolects.
Yeah.
Or would you say that was the case in your experience?
In my experience, I feel like it can be exhausting at times, because especially once you have to do both to an equal amount, it can be hard to find yourself amongst the two different kind of personas and lifestyles that you lead, especially if both are always or both ways of acting are always deemed as the proper way depending on situations that you're in. It can be exhausting, and it can be a little isolating, because you live behind two different kind of personas. Maybe at school, I'll s- I'll speak in a different way than I do at home. But if I come home speaking the way I do at school, I'm deemed as too white. And if I speaking the way I do at home at school, I'm deemed as, informal or improper or, uneducated.
So there's pressure from both sides where a lot of people maybe only recognise the pressure from the school side. They might kind of be aware that people have to feel they have to put on a standard way of speaking at school. There's also the pressure from the home side where you don't want to, or maybe you feel like you shouldn't appear kind of too white at home, or you know you have to code switch in that situation because you feel like you can't talk too white around your family because maybe it feels like you're kind of losing your roots or something, or they might worry you're losing touch with your culture, or
I think, yeah, I think it is that to a degree, because the job of a parent, can't say much about that, but what I assume is that you want to raise your child to carry yourself on and to be a better person than you. So if you raise a child speaking a certain way and you see them becoming, or delivering your culture out to the world, your ideals, your principles, to see that altered by something like the education system or their friends or whatever, that can make you a little worried, you know. Maybe some things to
yeah,
another degree. Maybe it's like something simple, like, you know, maybe maybe your child calls you out for, not washing your hands after you use the bathroom or something simple like that, you know. But
yeah.
getting challenged, seeing the challenge happening towards your child between your ideals and the school's ideals and the rest of society, how they want to structure your child, you know, that can be a little worrisome.
Do you think the pressure at school comes mainly in the form of hearing other people talking differently and feeling like you're in some way kind of abnormal, or do you think it comes mainly in the form of people actively, like teachers actively telling you you're talking wrong or you're using bad grammar?
It varies from, I would say it varies from person to person. I mean, every person's experience is different. It might depend on where you live and, how much AAVE you speak, or whatever kind of is a different dialect you speak. But I think even if teachers aren't excessively drilling you about it, like saying like, hey, the way you speak isn't right, or, you can't use ain't, and you can't use ain't in school because this is an educated place and that is uneducated talking, even if it isn't that, you still can feel left out based on the way you communicate. Because even if people can understand you, when you talk and whatever, because you talk a different way, it makes you feel very sad. Because if you want to make friends with somebody, it's probably because you have something in common with them. But if there's many things that you find uncommon with you and your friend, you lose that kind of
Yeah,
connection between them.
like if something as fundamental as the way you talk is different, then it feels like there's some kind of barrier between truly kind of understanding each other, or
Yeah, it feels like there's a disconnect. This can happen, not even on a speech level, just behaviorally, because, maybe your household culture varies from your friends' household culture. What is acceptable, what isn't acceptable.
AAVE has a lot of quite complicated grammatical aspects that standard English doesn't have, and those are often obviously taken to be just bad English or poor English by people who aren't educated or people who aren't part of the community. So if you were to use, so I think the example we used the other day was, hang on, I'm going to scroll back through the chat so I can look for it. So like the difference between, I'll type them out in the chat and I'll show them on screen. So like the difference between two sentences like that
Mm.
is a fully grammatical, correct me if I'm wrong, a fully grammatical difference in AAVE, which mean two slightly different things.
Yeah, coming from a standard American English perspective, I would assume that saying something like that might confuse, especially with my literary skills being about or in the format of standard American English. I was kind of baffled by reading it, as compared to just saying it. The
Yeah.
difference being one is present and the other one is habitual.
So if a standard American hears those and interprets them as meaning the same thing,
Right.
and an AAVE speaker meant different things when they said them, then that may be. I think possibly because AAVE has no kind of standard written form either, and it's not taught in schools or prescribed in schools. So it's with your own native language, especially if you're not kind of prescribed it in school, you don't necessarily know the ins and outs of the grammar. You just use them automatically.
Yeah.
So if somebody uses those two sentences and they mean different things by them, then to have somebody tell them that's just bad grammar must be quite kind of alarming and confusing, because as far as you're concerned, that's perfectly normal grammar, and that's, you mean two different things and you're expressing yourself exactly as you've always expressed yourself. But to be told that's just bad grammar, those are the same thing and neither of them are right, that must be, I don't know, it must be.
It's almost, in a sense, demoralizing, and if pushed harder, depending on how harsh the person speaking is being criticized, it can almost be dehumanizing, because you feel like the way you speak is less than another person's. I feel like somebody should be able to express themselves in the way that they choose to express themselves, regardless of how they're told to, because maybe that's the best way
Yeah.
for them to do so.
The necessity of code switching can present problems for people who want to study the development of AAVE. So there are written records of older African Americans taken in the early 1900s in North Carolina, which show features that are not present in modern AAVE, and features that are present in modern AAVE are not present in these records. So it's difficult to tell whether this is a case of a North Carolinian version of AAVE that's just gone extinct now or is very, very rare now, and been replaced with a smaller regional variety from somewhere else, or if it's a case of code switching, if it's a case of the people not being able to speak natural AAVE around a white interviewer. So you had sentences like "bad people no come up" and "us no want for clothes summer or winter." So that's negation with the word no, and it also shows a rearranging of the pronoun system so that accusative pronouns become nominative. And these are both things that exist in modern prestige languages, and this construction in particular would have been the standard way of phrasing this in Old English. So these aren't grammatically, bankrupt ways of phrasing things. They're just not standard English. And the author says that neither of these things are commonplace in modern African American English, although somebody might correct that in the comments. I've never heard it myself, but of course I don't live in the US, so my exposure to AAVE is very, very limited. So the difficulty there is, has AAVE just changed very, very quickly in some places, or has there been a replacement of one version of it with another, or were these people code switching around a white interviewer? So as a result of that, a lot of discussion about the development of AAVE has had to focus on either modern AAVE, that is, as it was spoken in the last, as it's spoken now and in the last 40 years or so, and AAVE as represented in very, very fragmentary historical records from 1900 and not really much earlier. And one of the biggest questions historically has been, did AAVE start off as a divergent dialect of English, or did it start off as a Creole that got more and more anglicised until it became what it is today? So we know that during the period where slavery was practiced, you had people being kidnapped from very disparate West African cultures and language areas, often all being put into the same holding camp, and then being transported to North America and forced to interact with a lot of people that didn't speak their language. So you get the emergence of these Creoles, which had features of various West African languages and also features of English. So Jamaican patois is a good modern example of a Creole language that emerged from a situation of slavery. It's a fully grammatical, fully expressive language, and indeed it's thousands of people's first language around the world. But the alternative idea, which I think is more widely accepted, is that AAVE developed largely as a divergence from English. So people learning different dialects of English and other European languages, these smaller dialects of English drifting away from standard English just because of their relative isolation, not geographic isolation, but social isolation. And the social situation of AAVE is tied to the social situation of African Americans, which itself is extremely complicated. So it's not a linear progression from enslaved to freed to gradually getting more and more legal agency. It depends on region, it depends on individual circumstances. So William Du Bois, is from Massachusetts, I think, wrote about the time after slavery was illegalized in certain northern US states, but it was still legal for sort of 60 odd years in the South. And he describes a kind of tension between black families in the north that were already established freed families and families who were coming from the south because they wanted to get away from states which still had slavery. And obviously that put pressure on industries that black people were more likely to be working in. And that caused a tension between these two communities. So it was an incredibly complicated social situation, and I'll reference a couple of things in the description that explain it a lot better than I'm able to. And me and Blazon were talking off recording about the aspect of a lot of African American people living in a low socioeconomic situation, and whether Blazon felt any kind of feeling of commonality with other African Americans, either based on their status as African Americans or based on a shared socioeconomic background and the intersection of those two things.
I think, and this happens in many countries and many different places, being black kind of entitles you to a certain kind of experience, especially or in a lot of wealthier situations where the majority of the people that you would interact with is white or is the majority. Like, for example, I was listening to a half black, half Japanese man talk about his experiences just being, half black in a Japanese society. And as a kid,
Yeah.
You, of course, being in your classmates, you're raised in a possibly similar situation. But because there is a noticeable difference, maybe not in the way you speak, maybe not in the way you act, but just looking different, that kind of gives you a different experience. You know, for the longest amongst my peers, because I had an afro, many people felt obligated to touch it, and I would assume somebody who lives in a wealthier situation might have that similar experience. And of course, you can't. In a way, it's kind of wrong to assume that that just because they're black, they might have had that experience. Because of course there is the possibility that there isn't. But for me, interacting with strangers or people I haven't necessarily talked to before in school, speaking in AAVE, that's usually how it goes. Even though I may not know the background and how people or what experiences they've had, I think it's almost like a kind of universal kind of language or dialect or universal kind of way of connecting with somebody.
What was it we were going to talk about before we kind of went into the... Oh, it was prescriptivism, yeah. So off recording, we were talking about a recent thing that Paul from Lang Focus did, which was on prescriptivism versus descriptivism in linguistics. And I suppose that's a big problem in schools where people who speak kind of informal dialects, not just AAVE, I suppose, but any informal dialect, are kind of taught to some extent, you're talking wrong, you're using the wrong grammar, this isn't, or this isn't proper grammar, this isn't right. I think maybe it was you that raised the question of whether somebody kind of should be taught to some degree in a prescriptivist way if they speak something like AAVE. Is it, on the one hand, there's some sense that of course it's wrong to tell somebody this dialect is wrong or this dialect is less than standard English, but on the other hand there's the predicament of, you don't want to put somebody in a position where they might be less capable of handling themselves in a job interview or something because the employer might have these preconceptions about AAV as well. So that's the kind of dilemma that I think we were talking about.
One thing that I want to point out was that Paul from Lang Focus said that he made a point for descriptivism or a linguistic side of it. He said that all dialects of English are valid, but that something like standard American English should be taught to everybody so that way they can speak their own dialect with their own people, but be able to communicate freely with people who don't speak that dialect. And I think to a degree, I don't know, that it's interesting because, like, as we were saying before, some people might not be able to separate he walking around the block and he be walking around the block as two different kind of grammatical differences.
So if somebody doesn't speak AAVE, they might not get the actual meaning of he be walking around the block. They might just assume it meant
Right.
he is walking around the block or something like that.
And I think with the prescriptivist approach, it might be due to a teacher or somebody like that wanting to make sure that a child doesn't necessarily develop that confusion when speaking in the formal environment. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like they have a negative connotation with AAVE. Maybe it might be because there is or because there are grammatical differences between AAVE and Standard American English. They might want that child to speak in a way that might suit them better in life.
But do you think that often comes across as or manifests as making the child feel as though the dialect that their parents speak and that their parents have kind of spoken to them since they were a child is the wrong?
It can get to that because especially when other people witness or know about that ridiculement, or not ridiculement, but like correction, other people might feel obligated to do it, even if they can understand AAV. They might feel obligated to correct a child, which might turn into hatred or it might deem somebody as informal. But at the same time, it's because communication is all about conveying ideas, and if the way you communicate in an environment doesn't suit that, I think that it's just as wrong to correct somebody speaking AAVE to speak in Standard American English, just as it is wrong for somebody speaking Standard American English to be corrected by an AAVE speaker. I think by looking at Standard American English as a kind of central point, I think that it's kind of just as a ridiculous idea as to say like everybody should speak one universal language, to avoid the differences between between English and Spanish and like Russian or whatever the case may be.
There is an argument sometimes made, albeit by a very small number of people, that even if regional dialects and sociolects are just as expressive as the standard language, we should still be homogenizing towards the standard language just because it's more practical to all be able to understand each other in all situations. But I think this ignores the importance of language to culture and the importance of culture to people. I think the effect of language loss can be absolutely devastating for a culture. It can be crippling to a culture, and that in turn can be crippling to the people in that culture. So on that positive note, as I say, there'll be a part 2 of this coming at some point. We'll talk more about implicit bias and things like that. In the meantime, I'll probably upload something Anglo-Saxon or something similar, along those lines. Possibly a bit more staggered because things are a bit hectic at the moment, but hopefully relatively regularly nonetheless. But thank you very much for watching, and if anyone has any input or any corrections to anything I've said or any of their own experiences to share, do so in the comments, and hopefully we can have a kind of broader discussion about this. Thank you very much indeed for watching, and I will talk to you next time.
What do you have to say for yourself, friend?